Les doy la bienvenida de nuevo a este 18º Congreso Latinoamericano de Dinámica de Sistemas. Es un placer para mí presentarles la plenaria número 23 titulada Macrolab Template Tool for Comparative Macroeconomics, presentada por David. David, adelante, bienvenido.
Hello everyone, my name is David Wheat, and I'm joining you from my home office in Colorado in the Rocky Mountain region out west of the United States. It's a pleasure to be with you today, even under these circumstances. Of course, I would rather be with you in person. I've spoken to this conference twice in the past, in 2007 in Buenos Aires and 2012 in Medellin. Also in 2010, I was in Cali for the Colombian System Dynamics Conference. Maybe you noticed on this slide, I wear several hats these days, even in retirement. In normal times, I'm in Europe for about 2 months each year, and my courses are a hybrid mixture of face-to-face and online lectures. This year, however, all courses are entirely online, but I'm fortunate to be able to continue working with my colleagues and my students. My topic today is about a tool that can be useful if you're engaged in comparative macroeconomics. But first, I have some news. Those of you who are active in the economics chapter will be glad to hear that our Feedback Economics book is finally on its way to the publisher. It was truly a team effort, with my co-editors, Bob Cavanagh, Brian Dangerfield, Oleg Pavlov, and Mike Redzicki, 32 authors who produced the chapters, and 40 reviewers who saw our mistakes and suggested ways to do better. The result is a 20-chapter book divided into 5 parts: macroeconomics, microeconomics, resource economics, policy analysis, and a section called variations and reflections. And several authors have posted their models online. I'll be glad to contact you when the book comes out. Just send me an email that says you want to know. Now back to our topic. In Buenos Aires in 2007, I made 2 presentations. One was an SD translation of Jeffrey Sachs' poverty trap model. I developed a causal loop diagram of the theory he expressed in words and figures, and that's what you see here. In other words, I reframed his model into a CLD. Now, deliberately, these diagrams are very small. I don't want you to focus on the details. I want you to focus on the process of reframing someone else's model to a causal loop diagram. 2 years later, I wrote a paper about the housing price bubble that contributed to the worldwide financial crisis, using the same SD translation method. The essential results can be seen in these diagrams. 3 models of the housing price bubble issue. Obviously, each is very different from the others. Now, this was a 2-stage process. Before I could compare the 3 CLDs, I had to reframe the models as causal loop diagrams. The Great Recession revealed how fragile was the myth of the macroeconomic consensus that relied on dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, otherwise known as DSGE models. 4 years before the financial crisis launched the Great Recession, Robert Lucas, Nobel laureate, president of the American Economic Association, and champion of rational expectations, said macroeconomists knew how to prevent depressions. Too bad he wasn't speaking at London School of Economics in 2010 when Queen Elizabeth was there and asked the economist why no one saw this coming. Since then, many economists, those trained in a conventional way and those who learned economics as a second language, have been trying to improve macro. I'm going to give you 3 examples of this, and I think it would be easy for you to Google this basic information and get a lot more information about these 3 initiatives. First, let me call your attention to a special issue of the Oxford Review of Economic Policy that was published in 2018. And the special issue was called Rebuilding Macroeconomic Theory. Now, there are many good articles in that special issue, And the common thread that runs through all of them is that each is addressing the question of how to improve or perhaps replace the benchmark model that was in place prior to the worldwide collapse in 2007. And that, of course, was a DSGE, so-called New Keynesian model. The second initiative has a similar name. It's called Rebuilding Macroeconomics, but it's an interdisciplinary research project in the UK. Now, the first item, the Oxford Review special issue, probably includes mostly economists that we would think of as being orthodox or mainstream economists who are open to critiquing their own work, very open-minded. The second group includes many people like that, but it's also more interdisciplinary and includes a few what we might call heterodox economists, those who pursue a different methodology. And the stated mission of the Rebuilding Macroeconomics group, which is, by the way, well funded in the UK, is to transform macroeconomics into a policy-relevant social science. I've been to 2 or 3 of their conferences and I found them to be very motivational. The third stream of research that I will call to your attention is what I would call the stock flow consistent economist stream. And these are primarily economists who work in the Wynne Godley tradition. And now that Wynne has passed away, I guess we would refer to that, the leader of this group might be Macrolab, a French-Canadian economist. So the common thread that runs through everything that stock flow economists do is the notion that there are no black holes anywhere. Money doesn't just come from nowhere and go to nowhere. There has to be a start, there has to be a finish. Every dollar that goes somewhere must come from somewhere, and this is extremely important when you come to policy analysis and you're trying to ask the what if questions. And frequently, it's been very common over the years for shocks to the economy to be subjected to the model, and then some conclusions be drawn when in fact it's not clear where that money comes from and whether that money could indeed be sort of conjured up out of thin air without drawing down on somebody's bank account somewhere in the economy, and that's nowhere to be found in the model. Well, stock flow consistent economists are definitely opposed to that kind of modeling and try to come up with what they call the watertight plumbing in their models. And so this is something that is very appealing to system dynamicists. There aren't many in this group that I would call system dynamics modelers. I'd like to think of myself as part of that group. Others in that tradition, you're probably familiar with Karu Yamaguchi, of course Steve Keen, and there are a few others, but the closest that most of these economists get to our way of thinking is with agent-based modeling. But I think that even indicates that they're open to different ways of organizing the methodology to answer the questions they have in mind. Another group that's very closely aligned with the stock flow consistent economists would be the post-Keynesians. So what's required here is a tool for reframing and comparing complex macro models, because this is a tough job. Comparing complex models requires some tool that allows you to put models side by side and then draw some conclusions, both from the structure and the behavior of the model. And so I'm going to suggest that one possible tool that we'll look at today is this Macrolab template. About 20 years ago, I began using Stella to develop a simple model called Macrolab. It was designed to help first-year students learn about stocks, flows, and feedback, and introduce them to dynamic modeling. At the 2007 Buenos Aires conference, you gave me 2 opportunities to speak, and my second topic was Macrolab. We've continued to make changes in the model, hopefully improvements, and in recent years, a software framework has evolved, and we call it the template. It's made the current version of Macrolab fully customizable. Different behavioral hypotheses can more easily be studied, and quite different versions of Macrolab can be compared in a more useful way. Now, the point I want to emphasize, however, is that Macrolab template is a framework. It's not the same as Macrolab 20, our current version. That's a model. So the takeaway message is that the template can be used as a framework for any macro model. It's useful for representing any set of behavioral hypotheses. It's even useful for building models from scratch. It's useful for experimenting with alternative behavioral hypotheses, and it's useful for comparing the structure and behavior of macro models. So let's take a look at what I would call the generic template, and it's something that is quite flexible and easy to modify. So the top level of the model has some fairly simple components. We have 3 submodels: demand, flow of funds, and supply. And then we have a flow, an inventory, a stock, and another flow. So this stock flow process right in the middle of the diagram is central to the template. It's the pivotal stock flow process that really kickstarts the feedback loops that connect the entire economy, or the entire model economy. The main output of the supply side is production capacity and capacity utilization. And by definition, real GDP is equal to their product, production capacity multiplied times capacity utilization. Notice that's not a behavioral assumption, not a behavioral hypothesis, but an identity. The other main output from the supply side is the price index. When the price index divides into the nominal aggregate demand with another identity, you get real aggregate demand. So at this top level, and in fact, nowhere in the generic model will you find any behavioral hypotheses. So we start with some basic identities, and then it's the modeler's responsibility to add the theory to the structure. The supply side submodel is primarily concerned with questions and decisions regarding production and pricing. The demand side submodel is where we get the spending decisions by the various sectors in the economy: the households, the business firms, government, and the foreign customers as well. And then this demand side submodel also includes, in the more advanced models, the financial sector. So you would have commercial banks, you would have a central bank that provide the credit for the much of the spending that takes place in a model economy and in the real world economy. And then the flow of funds aggregates these spending decisions and allows you to trace the flow of money as it moves around the economy. And the flow of funds structure also keeps track of the accounting and is responsible for generating the balance sheet that comes out for each sector. And then it also generates a consolidated balance sheet for the entire model economy. And then, as I said, we've got this pivotal stock flow feedback process in the middle. Now we'll take a look at the generic, what I would call level 2 of the model. One level down inside the supply submodel, you'll find 5 generic submodels. Now, I emphasize the word generic because the modeler who works with a template can either increase or reduce the number of submodels depending on how the modeler wants to aggregate or disaggregate the decision making on one side of the model economy or the other. So in this case, we have, starting with at the top, the targets for production and capacity. This submodel will receive the inputs coming from the top level. So real AD and inventory information will come into the supply side and first enter right here. And then depending on the behavioral assumptions that the modeler makes, that will have an influence on the factors of production and on output. And then there's all kinds of interactions that are postulated to be taking place here. We won't discuss those in any detail, but this is just to give you an idea of how the generic structure of the template looks. And it's up to the modeler to decide whether to change these in any way, to change the name, or to add or to subtract from this basic structure, depending on the purpose that the modeler has in mind. Now let's look at the demand side. So this is probably one of the most complex versions of the template, and many models will not have this much structure and this much interaction, but this is what you would find, for instance, in Macrolab 20, where we have the 3 or 4 in this case, because we have rest of the world, the 4 spending sectors of this model economy, and then we have the commercial banks and the central banks, and there's quite a bit of interaction all the way around. We're going to look at some of that in more detail later today. And then the last submodel is the generic flow of fund structure. This may be the one that's least familiar to some of you, although those of you who remember the original early versions of Macrolab may remember that there was some structure like this, even back in 2005, 2006, or 2007. So what we're seeing here is the movement of money from one deposit or one stock of assets, which for households could comprise cash. It could include deposits. It could include bonds. It could be various types of financial assets. In simpler models, this would be strictly bank deposits for the households. And then we'd have something similar for business firms. Government also has deposits. These are typically on deposit not at commercial banks, but at the central bank. But the household and the firm deposits are on account at the commercial banks. So these are the assets of the households and the businesses, and they represent the liabilities of the banking sector. And if we take a look at the flows that move, we'll just look at a few of these. So up at the top of the screen, we can see the outflow of consumption from the household sector becomes an inflow to the firm sector. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are no behavioral hypotheses or equations in the generic structure of the model. And even after the model is developed, and it's a full theoretical model, and there are behavioral hypotheses on the demand side, on the supply side, there are none here, because this particular submodel actually collects and organizes the spending decisions and the credit decisions made in the demand side submodel. So for instance, notice the H as a prefix on the consumption variable. So this indicates that this is the consumption that takes place based on the decisions made within the household sector on the demand side of the model. Likewise, the taxes paid by the households in the demand side of the model. So there's no new equation here, no new behavioral hypothesis. This is just organizing and channeling the decisions that are made elsewhere. And then several of these, I guess 4 of them, are quite important for thinking about aggregate demand. So consumption, government purchases, investment, and net exports comprise aggregate demand. And then this aggregate demand is an output to the top level of the model, and then becomes an input to the outflow equation from inventories when we divide by the price index and get real aggregate demand. And then the flows down here are the credit flows, net lending to households and to firms, the net interest payments to both sectors, and also it's assumed that all the shares of the banking sector are owned by households, and so at the end of the day, dividends, whatever the profit is assumed to be all distributed to the households, and the households pay all the taxes. Just like the dividends are all distributed to the households, and the households pay all the taxes. That's just a way of simplifying the model a little bit, letting the households pay the taxes rather than the firms and the banks. But if one needed to, if the purpose of the model called for a different structure, that could easily be done. So this gives you kind of a quick overview of what the high-level structure of the model looks like. You haven't seen yet the equations that would be in the submodel, and you wouldn't see those unless you're looking at a pre-built model that was relying on the template. And we'll take a look at some examples of those in just a moment. So we're just getting started with this agenda, this research agenda of comparing macro models, and actually what precedes that is reframing. So just like several years ago when we were looking at Jeffrey Sachs' model in 2007, then later the housing price bubble models, what we were doing was reframing someone else's model into a system dynamics version of that model. And in those cases, it was strictly a qualitative model using causal loop diagrams. Now, however, we're looking at reframing complex macro models using the template. And so far, we've done this with a few basic Keynesian models, the Keynesian cross, the ISLM model, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and then a few SD-based macro models, in particular Nathan Forrester's PhD model in 1982, the first published version of Macrolab, and then more recently, the so-called three-equation new Keynesian model that I wrote along with my colleague from Ukraine, Mariana Oleszkiewicz, a mathematical economist at Ivan Franko University in Lviv. So next on our agenda, we want to extend that. Mariana and I, and also in collaboration with Alina Novik, one of our other collaborators on several related projects. We want to also reframe the benchmark stock flow consistent model that we find in Godley and Lavoie. So before, when Godley passed away, he and Marc Lavoie produced what's now become really the reference book for stock flow consistent modeling that so many economists around the world are looking to. And there's what we might think of as a benchmark model in that book, and we want to reframe that using the template. And then after we have reframed several models, we will take those that have similar purposes and we will start comparing them with each other and then eventually with Macrolab 20. So now I'm going to give you an example of comparing after reframing. So after models have been reframed, they can be compared with other models using the same framework. On the left is the flow of funds submodel in Macrolab 20. It's the same as the generic flow of funds structure you saw a few moments ago. On the right is my interpretation of the implicit flow of funds structure in Nathan Forrester's macro model in his 1982 thesis. These two models were developed with different purposes in mind, so it really makes no sense to compare them from a theoretical perspective. However, I show them here because this provides a clear illustration that the template is flexible. It's not a straitjacket. The model on the right is considerably different from the generic flow of funds structure. Since the Nathan Forrester model has no explicit flow of funds structure, it was necessary to study his model very closely to infer this implicit structure, and the template served as a guide during that process. Our final task today is to compare two template-based models that differ only slightly. And the example is taken from our chapter in the Feedback Economics book, where we demonstrate how to build a simple model called SIM. Now, we had two purposes for SIM. One was to motivate beginners to build a macro model, and the other was to motivate macro specialists to understand it quickly and then modify, extend, or replace the SIM with a model of their own using the framework provided by the template. Now, here are the high-level submodels of SIM. And we will not spend a lot of time here on the details, but the takeaway message is the simplicity of this little model. So if you look at the supply side, you can see that we've reduced it from 5 or 6 submodels in generic structure down to 3. And we have collapsed the factors of production and productivity all into the output submodel and working with a variable called production capacity. And that also is the submodel where we determine capacity utilization. And capacity utilization has an impact on price. So we still have the main outputs from the supply side being production capacity and capacity utilization and price. And then on the demand side, we have only the 3 spending sectors. We've left out the financial sector as an active component of the model. And you can see the interaction that occurs here where the households are paying taxes. The government is sending the tax rate information down to the households and applying it to the disposable income that's received from the firms. And then the households are spending their consumption funds, and that goes into firms. And then government is also buying goods and services. So it's a basic structure. There's no borrowing in this model. That's the key idea. That to simplify, we're using the central bank merely to hold the deposits of the government. The commercial banks merely hold the deposits of the households and the firms. So when these deposits change, then the assets and the liabilities of the commercial banks change dollar for dollar simultaneously. Now, this is important because we want to be able to calculate some balance sheet information, and having the liabilities and the deposits captured in this counterparty relationship is necessary for that. And that's one of the functions performed by the flow of funds submodel. So now we're going to drill down into SIM. We're going to look at the demand side and the supply side. And this really will clarify for you, I think, what the template contains when you first start using it. And the generic template would be a little more complicated than this. There would be more parameters on the screen that if we were to show it for the generic version. But the simple version is quite easily understood and easy to explain. So the first thing you should recognize is that the red circles are the inputs to the submodel, and the green circles are the outputs from each submodel. So for example, the government has an output of the tax rate, and since only the households are paying the taxes, the tax rate becomes an input in the household sector. The government has government purchases as an output, and that becomes an input to the firm sector. And then one of the outputs from the firm sector is wages and dividends. And then the wages and dividends are multiplied by the tax rate to produce the taxes that are outputs from the household sector. And then consumption somehow, and we have to think about this in a minute, through some sort of behavioral hypothesis, somehow households decide how much to consume, and they spend their money, and then it becomes an input to the firm sector. So that's the basic idea. On the supply side, we see something similar. So we have real AD and inventories as inputs to the supply side, and the outputs are these production and capacity targets. And that's what influences the change in production capacity and capacity utilization, which are the outputs from this submodel. And capacity utilization in particular influences the price index and therefore inflation. So a very simple model. Now the point I want to stress here is that notice there's no theory here. This is a theory neutral shell of a model. And what we've included are parameters to get you started with the theory that's already implicit in SIM. So in this case, we have the parameters you need to build the SIM model. If you were starting from scratch, you would be looking at a variety of inputs and outputs, and you could either keep those that you want to keep, you could throw away those that are not necessary for your particular modeling purpose, and you could add others that we perhaps did not include in the generic structure. But the real task of the modeler is to decide on the outputs from each submodel, and then based on behavioral hypotheses that modeler adopts, the modeler's own mental model, decide on the necessary inputs to that submodel. Now, different modelers could conclude and reach the same conclusion about what should be the inputs and outputs, but they may have different behavioral hypotheses about the conversion process, where the inputs are converted to outputs. So it's a very flexible structure, and the SIM shell that you would receive, and I'll be glad to send you a copy if you're interested, the SIM shell will come to you just like this, and then there will be some instructions for how to build the actual behavioral hypotheses that we have in SIM. And then that will lay the groundwork for anybody who wants to use that as kind of a jumping off point for modifying some of those behavioral hypotheses. And we're going to look at one example here in just a moment. But first, I think it might be useful to take a rather high-level view. I know most of you are quite familiar with looking at causal loop diagrams, which in our chapter we refer to as a feedback diagram. And I want to emphasize that this structure, this causal loop diagram, was built after the SIM model was built. It wasn't a starting point for us. Our approach is to build a simulation model first, the stock and flow model first, and then that becomes our theory, and then we build causal loop diagrams as a way to simplify our communication of what our underlying simulation theory is. So the key point I would like to make next is that this is structured in a way that really corresponds to the structure you've already seen. At the bottom of this screen are the links that make up the supply side of the model. Everything below this line right here. So you see real GDP adds to inventories, real AD subtracts from inventories. By the way, the solid links are positive and those that are dotted are negative. And then together inventories and real AD define the production target, and then the production target determines the capacity utilization, and also with some time lag determines a capacity target, and production capacity actually changes. But while production capacity is what it is, or maybe while it's changing, we can multiply these two together and get real GDP. And then capacity utilization is driving the price index, which along with the GDP determines our investment and wages bill based on our propensity to invest, and also the labor share of production. And then let's follow this on up to the demand side, and now we have an important money stock here called the deposits of the firm deposits. And the inputs of the firm deposits are the income, which is the consumption spending, the government spending, and the investment spending. And the expenses are the outflows from these deposits. So investments is also an outflow. Remember that the firms are both the spenders and the receivers of investment spending. So they're on both the inflow and outflow side of their deposit stock. The key residual outflow, however, is the dividends. So once the other expenses are taken care of in the SIM model, dividends is what's left over after the firms make decisions about the amount of retained earnings they need to maintain their firm deposits at a certain level. Remember, it's very important to remember that there's no borrowing in this model. So business firms and households and governments have to manage their bank accounts very well because there's nowhere to go to borrow money. And then the wages and dividends come together to produce the income for the households, part of which is taken in taxes, which leaves them disposable income, which then goes into household deposits, and household deposits is driving consumption. And then consumption subtracts from household deposits. And then taxes adds to government deposits. Government deposits is important in determining the rate of government spending, which then subtracts from government deposits. And then the government purchases, consumption, and investment make up nominal AD, and we're back to where we started after we divide by the price index. Now let me call your attention to the top right-hand corner, one portion of this little diagram, and that's the government sector. So we're now going, as our final exercise will be to take a close look at the submodel of SIM where the government behavioral hypothesis has been expressed. And what we're going to do is to look at the structure and the behavior of that submodel, but then think about an alternative submodel, an alternative hypothesis. And with the template, it's very easy, just with copy and paste, if you have the alternative already built, to replace one hypothesis with another, and we can see the results from that. So here's the original behavioral hypothesis. This is the original government submodel in SIM. So here's the inflow of taxes from the household sector. The tax rate is exogenous. It's fixed. And this is an important distinction between this hypothesis and the one we'll look at in just a moment. And then government deposits are being managed on the outflow side by the deposits coverage target, which I think is 3 months in the government sector. Remember, the government can't borrow, so it has to make sure that it maintains a certain amount of money in the bank account. And the government purchases reflects the inflow of taxes affecting government deposits, and then the coverage target of, let's say, 3 months determines what is permissible to spend. Now, obviously, if government deposits are rising, government purchases are rising. If government deposits are falling, then that produces a cutback in government purchases. Obviously, very simple, and one would say almost simplistic, but it's a way to get started with macro modeling. But the key idea is the tax rate is fixed. So let's do a little experiment. We're going to shock the model with a $400 billion a year increase in government spending early in the simulation run. So you can see that the spending goes from 3.4 trillion a year up to 3.8. It's a 400 billion increase in expenditures. And then the revenue, however, doesn't keep track with that, because in order to get this, well, I'm jumping ahead of myself. So let's just follow this pattern here. So the expenditures start dropping, and why did they drop? Because the revenues have not responded in any magnitude approaching this increase in expenditures, and this jump in outflow is draining the government deposits. Now, it doesn't go negative, but it falls below the target level set by this DCT, deposit coverage target. And the result is, this is a very short-lived government stimulus. It's fairly quickly, the government spending returns to something close to its original level. There's a little bit of a multiplier effect, but you can see it's not much above the original flat line. Now, this is our traditional time series way of looking at the output of the simulation, but below it you can see another way, and that is the result of, I've taken excerpts from the balance sheet for this particular model. When the model begins, or when the simulation begins, we have a total of $15.2 trillion in the private sector bank accounts, which are assets for these two sectors and liabilities for the commercial banks. And then these are the commercial banks' assets in their deposit at the central bank. And then the government has $850 billion on deposit at the central bank. After 5 years of simulating, what we can see is the money supply in the economy, which is the private sector deposits, there's no cash in this model, has increased by $95 billion. Where does this money come from? It comes from the government deposits. Remember, government's not borrowing, but what government is doing is running down its own deposits, and so more money enters the private sector. In this case, there's a $95 billion reduction in the level in the government deposits. So that's the outcome of the spending shock in the original behavioral hypothesis. Now let's take a look at the alternative behavioral hypothesis. This is one where the tax rate can vary. Still, government cannot borrow, but if the government deposits begin to fall below their desired level, then the tax rate will rise. So this is an example of the modeler making the assumption that managing the deposits is done on the inflow side of the model. The previous version, the deposits were managed by regulating the outflow. Now we're regulating the inflow. So the tax rate depends on the purchases and the deposits, and if there's a discrepancy between desired and actual deposits and purchases are changing, let's say because population is changing, right now it's constant for this experiment. So the only thing that's changing is the shock. It's the same shock we had before. And eventually the tax rate rises to about 22% from its original value of 20%. It's still an outflow still an output to the household submodel, but it's not a fixed parameter any longer. It's now a variable. Let's take a look at the impact of the same shock. So now the response of the government sector when the government deposits start falling is not to cut back on expenditures to get the deposits back in line, but to increase taxes, and the expenditures stay at a much higher level. Notice, however, that there's a period when the revenues, this is due to the delays down here in this structure, and this is really part of a big feedback loop. It goes all the way to the household sector and back to this flow. There's a period when the revenues are exceeding the expenditures. So money is being taken out of the private sector as long as the red curve is above the blue curve. And we can see that down the balance sheet, that the money supply in the private sector has declined from 15.2 trillion to 15.092 trillion. And that difference is exactly reflected in an increase in the government deposits. So we have stock flow consistency here. So here we have a way of comparing alternative hypotheses, and the point I'd like to make is that with the template, it was quite easy to substitute one hypothesis for another with the rest of the model remaining the same. We had the same inputs and the same outputs from this submodel, which made it extra easy. All we did was to change the behavioral assumptions inside. So in a nutshell, I guess what we would say is that the Macrolab template is theory neutral. It's the modeler that determines the hypotheses and the equations. And I use the term nutshell. So in the initial shell that you receive from me, if you like to receive a copy of this template, is a shell that only includes placeholder parameters with no behavioral equations. It will, however, have both sides of the economy represented. This is not a supply side or a demand side template. It really says you cannot have a modern model economy and ignore either production or purchasing. But the modeler still decides which side to emphasize. And they're united by this stock flow feedback process. So I use the term systemic plug and play framework. It's easy to replace one behavioral hypothesis with another and analyze the behavior. But this plug and play modeling is not like connecting home entertainment system. I mean, theory building is hard. And in a complex feedback system, it's hard to do just one thing. So systemic plug and play requires thinking of an ensemble of alternative hypotheses, not just replacing one hypothesis and ignoring the impact on the rest of the economy. So looking for an ensemble of alternative hypotheses and how they perform together instead of separately. So this is fundamental to the holistic perspective in the SD approach to macro modeling. Now, I'll conclude with an offer to you. If you're interested in all of this, it'll be several months before the book is published and our chapter can be read. But if you want to build a model from scratch, email me for the shell template for the SIM model. There's also going to be a video recording of the chapter's how-to section, so you'll see exactly how the model is built, and these are available now. There's also a pre-built version that's ready for exploring and simulating. So even if you're not interested in building the model, you can go to this website and run the model online. And of course, you'll need the slides in order to follow up on this. You probably don't have time to write it all down now. So send me an email if you'd like a copy of the slides. So I'd be pleased to hear from you, and I hope you enjoy the conference.
Muchas gracias, David, por esa presentación. Les recuerdo a nuestros asistentes que pueden comentar, felicitar, preguntar a David lo que deseen desde nuestro aplicativo Slack. Nos vemos en una próxima contribución. Hasta pronto.
Hola, soy el profesor Johnny Valencia de la Universidad de Aysén y los estoy invitando para que este año se inscriban y participen en el Congreso Latinoamericano de Dinámica de Sistemas. Será una excelente oportunidad para que entre todos compartamos los trabajos, los avances y los desarrollos que desde la ciencia del modelado y la simulación estamos haciendo. Hablaremos de temas de energía, de agro, de sostenibilidad, de diseño de políticas y podremos fortalecer las redes con las que pues, nos interesa tanto cada vez estructurar soluciones para nuestra sociedad. Un abrazo muy grande desde la Patagonia chilena y nos vemos en el Congreso.